Good morning, everyone. That was pretty inspirational. Diane, thank you. That's what I call starting us off right. So thank you. My name is Renee Willis, and I am with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And I have the pleasure this morning of introducing our next speaker, Emily Badger. Emily Badger is a staff writer at the Washington Post, where she covers national urban policy for Wonk blog, the paper's public policy vertical. She writes frequently about urban planning, housing, transportation, poverty, inequality, and why each is intimately connected to the other. She's particularly interested in how technology will change the way we move around cities, why the design of cities matters for economic mobility, and what it means for all of us to live in an increasingly urban world. Before joining the Post, she was a staff writer at the Atlantic Cities. She has also written for Fast Company, Good, Pacific Standard, the New York Times, and the Christian Science Monitor, among other publications, many other publications. She has a journalism degree from Northwestern University and a master's in writing from Johns Hopkins University. She's originally from Chicago, and she currently lives in San Francisco. Please join me in welcoming Emily Badger.
Hello. Thank you guys so much for having me. I just realized that the disadvantage of not bringing my own slides is that we're all going to look at my face while I'm talking for the next 20 minutes. So, if we could maybe look at the view from Sheila's porch or that lovely children's book, if we could put that slide up while I'm talking, that would be great. So I really, really appreciate the invitation to be here with you guys. This room is full of people who have either helped me understand the topics that I write about, who read the stories that I write, who have shared them with a broader audience. And I'm incredibly appreciative to everyone in this community, for both doing the work that you do and for helping me spread the writing that I do about these same topics. So what I thought I would talk a little bit about today is a question that I'm frequently asked by people who are practitioners in the housing space with a little bit of sort of frustration, which is, why isn't housing a sexier topic in the media? And how do we get people to pay more attention to it? So is it fair for me to assume that this is something that you all are wondering about? Okay. I think Sheila has also actually asked me this once before, so I figured it would be an appropriate topic. But this is a question that I care about just as much as you do, because even though I'm not an advocate, as a writer, I want people to care about what I write about. I want the issues that I care about in my own writing to be as accessible to as wide of an audience as possible. I want to bring everybody on board to a story about housing issues, whether or not you work in the housing community, whether or not you personally feel like you have challenges with your housing. So, it is just as important to me in my fights with my editors and my publication to, get lots of attention for these stories as it is for you to do that. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this topic. And to the extent that people are often frustrated by how housing is covered in the media, I think that that is a very fair criticism. I think oftentimes we don't do a great job of covering housing issues in the media, and that's because we have this this very limited frame for how we think about this topic. On the one hand, we either treat housing as an asset, or we treat it as shelter, and that's kind of the end of the story. And what that means is that we'll write stories about how interest rates are going to be rising soon, so you should hurry up and go and buy a house now in order to make good on this potential investment. Or it means that we write stories about whether or not remodeling your bathroom this year is going to be a smart thing to do if you want your property value to rise. Or we write stories about, you know, this is the number of homeless people who are counted on the streets of Washington this year compared to last year, and that number is sort of the extent of what we have to say about homelessness. And, you know, or if we're talking about public housing or low-income housing, you know, all we're doing is looking at it as sort of the question of shelter. Do people have a shelter over their home or not? Is it a good shelter? Does it have, you know, broken pipes? Does it have problems? What's the quality of it? And in my experience, a lot of the writing, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this myself, you know, thinks about housing in one of these two ways, you know, as an asset or a shelter. And, you know, to me, I think the real issue is that this topic is so much more complicated than that. You know, housing is never just about shelter. You know, it is always also about something else or about 15 other things. You know, housing is about education, it's about criminal justice, it's about opportunity, it's about inequality, it's about wealth, it's about poverty. You know, it's about the health, it's about environment. I could continue listing topics all day long, and you know, I'm listing off the topics that have already come up from both Diane and Sheila this morning. But to me, you know, the best stories about housing in the media are stories that say, well, you know, how is housing connected to all of these other things? And I often think about my job as someone who writes about public policy, who primarily does sort of explanatory writing, of helping readers understand the connections between two things that most people don't think are related to each other. And so often, you know, based on my own sort of bias and point of view, one of those two things is always housing. You know, and I'm trying to, over time, sort of build stories that show you, you know, what housing has to do with education up here, what housing has to do with inequality over here. And one sort of byproduct of that is that, you know, whatever is going on in the news that people are talking about, I can find a way to make that a housing story. You know, Baltimore is a housing story. Ferguson is a housing story. And I mean, I'm preaching to the choir right now, but you know, I'm part of what I would like to convey to you is that, you know, the way that I try to write about housing is also, I think, a good way for you guys to try to talk to the media about housing, you know, to suggest that we're not just interested in getting coverage about whether or not people have roofs over their heads. We're interested in you explaining to the public that whether or not someone has a roof over their head is going to influence how their child does in school, or is going to influence all of these other things. So I went back and looked at a handful of stories that I and some other people have done over the last year, and pulled out 5 examples of particular stories just as an illustration of what I'm talking about, of a story that's about housing, but it's also about a bunch of other things. And just wanted to talk briefly through several of these examples. And then I was much more interested in us having a conversation and questions, since my seatmate in the back row also pointed out to me that it's only fair that I let people ask me questions, since I ask people questions every day, all the time. So the first story that came to mind when I'm thinking about, you know, how do you make housing relevant to much larger topics, is this Raj Chetty research that Diane put up on the screen earlier. And you guys have probably heard about this before, because it's quite relevant to the work that you do. But just a kind of quick summary of it, these economists, Raj Chetty, Nathaniel Hendren, and a bunch of their colleagues, they're based out of Harvard and Stanford, have done this really groundbreaking work that, you know, these are not housing researchers. They're economists. They don't think of housing as the thing that they study. What they're interested in is economic mobility. You know, how likely is it that poor children, by the time they're adults, are in the middle class or are, you know, even higher up in the income spectrum than their own parents were when they were children? And they have gotten all of this crazy tax data that no one else on the planet has access to. And they've used it to show that, you know, children who live in Salt Lake City have much greater odds of moving up the income ladder than children who grow up in Atlanta. And children who grow up in Seattle, much better shape than children who grow up in Detroit. And one of the big takeaways of their study, as Diane was suggesting earlier, is that where you live is incredibly important for setting the path that you go on for the rest of your life. And in a way that we can now tell, thanks to these economists, by looking at the rates of college attendance of children depending on where they grow up, or the amount of money that they earn depending on when they grow up. And when these economists came out with this study 2 years ago, I mean, it was sort of groundbreaking, because what it did was that it proved the value of place, which if you work in any kind of place-based work, you already know that place is very important, but it's incredibly helpful to have some Harvard economists come along and stick some numbers onto that everyone, that you could take to your congressman tomorrow and show them, and be really clear about that. And part of what I think is so valuable about the work that they've done is that they are taking a topic that is sort of foremost on the front of everyone's mind in the country right now, and that will be a big part of this election if we ever get around to talking about public policy topics, which is inequality and social mobility and economic mobility, and does everybody have access to opportunity? And they are saying that the answer to that question has to do with where you live. So to the extent that these topics do become really central to the national conversation in the election coming up, that is the story about housing. Economic mobility is about housing. Opportunity is about housing. And that to me is the perfect example of taking a topic that people are not thinking about in the context of housing and being able to draw a very sort of straight line between those two topics. This work that these economists have done has sort of come out in a series of waves with various studies, and the most recent one that they put out last year looked at calculating how much where you grow up, where you spend your childhood, influences your adult earnings at the age of 26. And they believe that the relationship between these two things is causal, that growing up your entire childhood in Baltimore City depresses your earnings at age 26 by a certain amount of money. Growing up in Fairfax County, Virginia, means that by age 26, you probably make about 20% more than if you, the very same person, had grown up in kind of somewhere in average America. And this is, proving sort of the value of place in a really quantifiable way. And I recently went back and looked at all of this data for a story that I was working on, where because they can quantify exactly how much where you live influences your earnings, they can rank every county in America. Places like Fairfax County are on the very top, and then there are other places on the very bottom. And they ranked 2,478 counties. And when I went back and looked at this original data recently, all the way down at the bottom, number 2,747, was Genesee County, Michigan. Does anybody know what's in Genesee County, Michigan? Flint. Right. And when I realized that, I thought, here's all of these pieces of the story coming together. Flint is a story about housing. It's a story about housing because quite literally the thing that was poisoning these children was coming out of their faucets in their homes. But it's also a story about housing because, this is a community where children have had every disadvantage in life, and this is a community where there's not a lot of opportunity given to children, and we've piled all this other disadvantage on top of them, with this lead problem. And so, if everybody over here is talking about Flint right now in the news, I have something to say about that from a housing perspective. So that's my first example, how housing is connected to opportunity and making sure that those two things are in the same story, in the same sentence. Another theme that I constantly come across is how housing is connected to health. Public health, the health of children, the health of environments. I mean, Flint is an example of this, but another really good example that has been in the news over the last year is also having to do with lead, is in Baltimore. One of the things that we learned fairly early on about Freddie Gray is that he grew up in a home that had lead paint in it. And a colleague of mine, his name is Terrence McCoy, he's a wonderful writer at the Post who also covers sort of poverty and social justice issues. He wrote this wonderful award-winning series of stories last year where, he took that one fact, that Freddie Gray grew up in a home that had lead paint in it and sort of started tugging on it and uncovered, this entire problem of the structured settlements industry. This is the industry of people who come along and take advantage of people who've received big settlement checks for, having been exposed to lead. And, there are actors in this industry who will come to you and say, how about instead of receiving monthly checks for the rest of your life from this settlement, we just give you one big check now. It doesn't add up to as much as all those checks over the course of your life, but we're willing to give it to you now. And, they're effectively taking advantage of people. And, they're frequently also taking advantage of people who, as a result of having been exposed to lead, are not in a great position to be financially calculating what is a better deal for them, receiving their checks over the course of their entire life or receiving one large lump sum now. And, the story that Terry wrote about this was a wonderful example of, a complicated, nuanced, really vital and relevant piece that was about housing, but it was also about health, but it was also about exploitation. And it's also about sort of industry and exposed, this entire business model that most people didn't know existed. And it was also about, the legal implications of how we regulate the structured settlement industry. So that's another, when I'm sort of dismissive of like stories that we write about interest rates, this is the kind of story that I'm talking about on the other hand, a piece that is about a whole lot of things that recognizes that, housing is connected to all of this other stuff. A third example that I was thinking of, this is another thing that I constantly come across, is stories that are connecting links between housing and education. And one that particularly sticks with me is I wrote about a study about a year ago that was conducted by Patrick Sharkey and Ingrid Gould-Ellen, some wonderful researchers at NYU who you're probably familiar with, and a handful of other people. And they did a study where they got a bunch of data on the home addresses of children in the New York City public school system. And then they got a bunch of data on the precise locations of incidents of violent crime. And then they got a bunch of data from the public school system on standardized test scores of these children. And, put all of that data together and were able to show that children who live in neighborhoods, not just neighborhoods, but children who live on a block where an incident of violent crime occurs in the 7 days prior to them taking a standardized test, perform worse on that test. And this is a story about, the point of it wasn't these children maybe witnessed the violent crime and were distracted by it. The point was that, there is something in the environment around them. Maybe they walk by the police tape that's left over from it, or their parents are talking about, this incident of crime that happened in the community around them. But, the whole idea was that, the home environments that these children are coming from, not just literally, the walls and the roof that they're inside of, but the block that they live on, the neighborhood that they live on, that environment is intimately connected to, what happens when they sit down at school when they get to school. And, teachers will tell you all the time that absolutely they believe that this is true. What happens in the home influences how children do at school, but we don't talk about that often enough. And we don't talk about, we don't talk about home environments, we don't talk about housing when we're fighting about, education reform and things like that. And, in this case, as I'm sort of like building my web of topics that are all connected to each other, here there's housing, and then there's education, and then there's crime and violence and neighborhood conditions. And, if I think sort of down the road about what are the implications of that, if these children aren't doing very well on these standardized tests, they're going to be less likely to, perform well in school overall, which is going to impact, their success later in life. Like, all of these things are connected. And, trying to make the case to people that you should care about all of these things. And, it's also often my experience that anytime you take two things that people don't realize are connected and you explain to people how they are, there's something kind of fascinating about that. People I think really appreciate having surprising things in the world explained to them. And, the simple fact that, a child who lives on a block where an incident of violent crime happens is less likely to perform well on a standardized test in the coming week, that is a surprising and interesting finding that I think, would interest a lot of people, and would get a lot of readers interested in this topic beyond simply saying this story is only about housing. It's not about lots of other things. The fourth story that I thought about, because it's top of mind, is I've been writing recently, along with half of the other writers who write about what I do, Matt Desmond's book Evicted, which also came up earlier. And his book was so powerful because it explained the connection between housing and poverty in a way that we are seldom talking about. The whole thesis of his book is that, being evicted, losing your home, having housing instability isn't simply something that happens to poor people. These are events that cause poverty. If you get evicted from your home and you have to move somewhere else, maybe you have to move farther away from your job and you lose your job. And, that's going to help push people into poverty. Or you get evicted from your home, you relocate, you're crashing on a friend's couch, and the notice gets mailed to your address reminding you that you need to show up for an appointment to keep your welfare benefits. You don't get that notice because you've been evicted from your home, and now as a result of that, you've lost your benefits, you're even poorer than you were before. I mean, this book was really wonderful and provided the opportunity for me and a lot of other writers to write stories about how, housing isn't just sort of a condition of poverty, it is also a creator of poverty for people when they have housing problems. And then just the last topic real quick, that I've been thinking a lot about, particularly over the last year, is housing is about race, and this has been so relevant in the news because of the Supreme Court disparate impact case, because of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And both of those things have provided these wonderful opportunities for me in the media, or for you when you're talking to the media, to try to help people understand that housing patterns, the fact that we live in segregated societies is not an accident. That has been created through public policy. That has all of these implications. To come back to the Raj Chetty research that I mentioned at the top, one of the things that's different between cities where children have good odds, poor children have good odds of having, economic mobility over life, and where children don't, is that places like Atlanta, where poor children don't do very well, are much more racially and economically segregated. And so, to the extent that I can write stories that are sort of connecting where you live to the history of racial injustice in this country, the fact that that's not just a historical artifact, that it continues to this day, that is another kind of story that is much more sort of deep and thoughtful and relevant, and brings a lot more people into the topic of housing than people who just think, I'm not a homeowner, I don't care about housing stories, or I'm not homeless, I don't care about housing stories. So before I completely run out of time, I would love to hear anybody's thoughts on this, or to have any questions about this topic, but yeah, go ahead in the back. Oh, yeah, why don't you come to the mic? Thank you.
We probably have time for about 3 questions, just to...
Sorry I talked for so long.
Okay. Good morning, Sue Watlow Phillips with MICA and the National Coalition for the Homeless. Just want to again thank Sheila Crowley for all of her great work, and encourage you to write a story. In 2001, Representative Sanders, now Senator Sanders and presidential candidate, introduced the Housing Trust Fund, and I had the opportunity to be with Sheila at the press conference at the Capitol at that time, and just encourage you to connect that with our Congressman Ellison, who has introduced the Common Sense Housing Investment Act, which is to do that mortgage interest deduction cap and change it into the low-income or into the tax credit. My question for you is that, having been involved for 45 years in housing and homelessness, it does not appear that awareness creates change. And as a psychologist, I can say awareness does not create change. And while we've had many, and I have many boxes of these research studies that have been done over the year, and we do a lot of personal stories, like with a family that becomes homeless and gets into housing. We don't do a lot of stories taking those pictures of these homes that are getting all these subsidies, these $1 million homes, and put them and say, this home is getting this subsidy, this would be 10,000 housing vouchers.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you would be willing to do that type of story.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite whipping boys is the mortgage interest deduction. I love writing about that. I mean, it drives my readers absolutely crazy to suggest to them, like, you get a handout from the government too. You know, people who love to judge aid that's received by poor people think that they don't get it themselves, and so to the extent that we can hammer on the fact that yes, you do. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful topic. I promise to you that I will write more about it. Yeah.
From Boston, Mass. I want to thank you for the work that you do. And, you know, we often know that the compelling subjects of the stories are the people who are suffering themselves. And I wonder what sort of care you take when you have a human subject that has been traumatized, that is surrounded by toxic stress. Because I've seen some, I mean, we know, you know, poor people are often bashed, particularly in comments, and as we work with and prepare families to speak with the media, we have to go through a whole entire preparation to prepare them for that backlash. You know, why are you having so many kids? Why don't you close your legs? And some really awful things that are said. And it doesn't seem, at least in Boston, from what I've seen in the Globe, that there's any protection for these families. So my question is, you know, how do you really seek to do that? And sort of in the broader sense of the media, where is the responsibility to add these protections for these families?
I don't know that I can protect them from my commenters. I mean, I can't protect myself from my commenters. Right. The way that I handle that is that I don't read my commenters.
I mean, we always suggest that.
But I do think that it is my responsibility to make sure that anyone who is going to be part of a story that I'm writing completely understands, you know, what that means. That means that, you know, the details that you're sharing with me, I'm going to include in the story. You know, if you agree to let me use your name, I'm going to put your name in the story. If you agree to, I'm going to send a photographer to you, and your picture may appear in the story. I mean, we never want any of those things to happen with people who are not fully on board with them and who don't understand what they're agreeing to. But the other thing that I would add is that I spend a lot of time also talking to people who don't want to be quoted and who don't want their stories published in the paper. And if you don't want your story published in the paper, that doesn't mean that I don't want to have a conversation with you anymore, because a lot of what I write is informed by conversations that I have with people that, you know, I am smarter about this topic if I have a conversation with 10 of the families you work with, even if none of those 10 families wants to have their name appear in the paper. So, you know, I guess I would also tell the families that you work with and the media that you work with, like, you know, we want to connect you to some people to help you understand this topic, to make sure that you have the right insights, but not everyone we're going to connect you to is going to want to be in the paper, and we're going to need to be very explicit about identifying which do and which don't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for 2 more quick questions and answers.
Would you make it 3?
If they're quick.
Good morning. My name is Lashadian. I'm with the McKinney Housing Authority. First off, I heard you say in the beginning statements that you're not an advocate. I would encourage you to use your statue and your platform as an accomplished writer to become an advocate and to see yourself as an advocate, to be a champion for housing poverty. I would like to follow you on social media, your blog, and your career, and see you as a champion for our housing poverty. I would also like to see you maybe do a story as we follow you to show that we are living in poverty as a result of 250 years of social and systematic racial injustice, and that when they see show these slides of Hispanic and minorities and blacks in poverty, that this is systematic. And had we been afforded the same opportunities to gain land 250 years ago, we would be rooted in a foundation better than what we are now. Thank you.
Do you guys want to post your questions or your comments, and then I'll just kind of respond to all of them at the end?
I had a very specific question. Mandy DeMeo, Housing Works Austin. And earlier this year, I love your writing and read it a lot. Earlier this year, you did a story that the headline kind of caught my eye, which was about luxury housing actually helps poor people. And I kind of put it out through our social media, just what do folks think? And I read through the California study that you referenced, and it was very controversial, locally at least, particularly in an area like Austin, like San Francisco, I assume like DC as well, that are experience gentrification, huge gentrification issues, and oftentimes we look at luxury housing and say, well, this is part of the problem. And I was wondering if you got any pushback, or was there good conversation generated from that story? And have your thoughts changed since you published that story? I'm just really interested in that topic.
Sure. Oh, do you want to go ahead?
Is it okay? Okay. First of all, I'm John Zerker from Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm on one of the largest sites in Nashville. We're going through the RAD right now. But that young man said most of what I wanted to say. Thank you, sir. I wish you could have been a part of this forum so that you could have expressed more what's really going on. But the thing that you did say about the cities and the research that's been done as far as where you position in life, no one has been saying anything about the pipeline in communities that lead directly to prison. And so my question to you is, would you be willing to speak to people like that young man or myself who also sit on the board here in the National? There's no movement. We come up here and we're talked to. You need to hear from us too about what's really going on in our communities. We're being talked to about about the research and things that you're expressing to us. I said it yesterday, you're still preaching to the choir. But would you come and talk to some of us people who are living in these communities in the grassroots, in the trenches, where you can get some information? Because there should have been a movement a long time ago, because we're still being pushed back. And I'm going to stop right there. And I hope you can respond to that, because there are people here who have some information that we need to rise up all over the country, because this thing is bigger than us by ourselves. It's what we can do together we can't do by ourselves. I'm going to stop right there for the sake of time. Thank you.
Okay, real quick. Yeah, I mean, I don't ever only want to talk to academics or policymakers or people in Washington. I always want to talk to people on the ground in communities, and if you want to grab me after I walk off the podium and give me your contact information, I would absolutely love to have that conversation. The second point about the relationship between market rate housing and housing for the poor, yes, I got lots of pushback about that, and a lot of it was about economists disagreeing with sociologists and housing advocates about the relationship between market rate housing and low-income housing, and whether or not increasing supply for everyone benefits low-income people too. And about a week after we ran that piece, I ran kind of like a roundtable where I got about a half dozen people with varying perspectives from sociology and economics to sort of have that fight for me on my website. And if you want to grab me afterward, I will get your contact information and send you the link to make sure that you have that, because absolutely, that was the start of a conversation, and I've been trying to continue it. And then the last point was about me thinking about myself as an advocate. I mean, I would say that I think about myself as someone who cares deeply about these problems the same way that you care deeply about these problems. But it's sort of like in my DNA as a journalist to be unbiased, to not be a player in the game, to be an observer of the game. And so that's why I say I'm not an advocate, but even being unbiased, I can sort of call bullshit when I see it, and it doesn't mean... Hello. Yeah, being unbiased doesn't mean, saying like, yes, climate change deniers have some points and other climate change people don't have some points. Like, I'm not going for like false equivalency, but I think that the best way that I can contribute through this is, not by doing the kind of work you do, it's by writing about it from the standpoint of a journalist. So I think I really need to get off the stage. But please do grab me. I will stick around for a little bit, and if you want to, grab me in the back.
Yeah, hello. How you doing?
Yes.
My name is Tamiko Holden. I'm from Chicago.
Uh-huh.
We actually have a few different problems going on. As a Section 8 resident, we're under fire from wanting to live in high upper opportunity areas.
Yeah.
So not only is our housing authority under fire, the residents are being under attack. So not only do we have, now people start off as organizers, but now we have our organizers thinking you can speak for us. So we're having all of these different issues. We also have our areas that once was called destitute being turned into opportunity areas. So we're being pushed out and priced out, and now the gentrification now, you're gonna overprice us, so now we can't get back in. So how do you turn all of this around? You're speaking for us, but you don't know our problems. So how do you flip all of this around? You started out organizing for us, now you're speaking for us, but you can't tell our story. So how do you fight against that?
I mean, all I can do is insist that anytime I write a story, I'm not just talking to professional advocates. I'm also talking to the people who they represent. And so that's what I can do on my end, and on your end, you can just make very clear to the people who do represent you that, to the extent that they represent you, they don't, their voice is not your voice, and your voice needs to be heard also.
Because we represent ourselves very well, but people don't understand when you're not saying what they want you to say, that you're not intelligent enough to speak fluently and pretty much articulate very well for yourself. So how do you, but then again, our people are still under the microscope and our lives being exploited like Sideshow Bob.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I understand that happens, and I'm sorry that happens. And I can do the best that I can as a reporter, but I can't control what other reporters do. But anyway, thank you so much. And
All right, I have the worst job in the world, which is to say we have to keep moving. But please, let's hear it for Emily Badger. Thank you. Okay. So we'll take a 15, we're going to make it a 12-minute break. Let's be back here at 10:20. Coffee is right outside here, and we'll be back here at 10:20.